Hi, good day everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. Before we get started, can I kindly request that you guys give me a wave of hands to show that you can hear me? That would be much appreciated. Alternatively, you can pop something through on chat. Awesome. So, yeah, a lot of hands there. That's fantastic. Thank you all for confirming. Okay, perfect. Thank you all so much for joining our webinar today. My name is Alex. I'm Leaders National Trainer, and I look after the pre-sales for Ubiquiti at Leader as well. So today we're going to be doing a webinar that's very focused on the setup of the Ubiquiti products. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the networking products, so more on the access point and switch side of setup. But this is kind of intended to be a guide for everyone from starting from scratch all the way up to seasoned pros to kind of understand the best practice for setup. This isn't an exhaustive guide. It's kind of the skills that I've built up over the last couple of years. And this is typically how I deploy sites when I am setting them up. So this webinar is a little bit unique. It is going to definitely run over the 30-minute time allocation. If you are unable to stay for longer than that period of time, this webinar will absolutely be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel this evening. So if you want to watch that after the fact, you're more than welcome to as well. I completely understand if you have to run. Apologies for that, but once I got started with the webinar, I realized there was too much content to go through in order to squeeze it into 30 minutes. If you see a timer at the top of your screen, don't worry about that timer. It's just a countdown of how long it thinks the webinar has to go. So the goal of this webinar is to basically cover your basis in terms of setup. Once this webinar is completed, you should be able to easily expand from here and build these types of environments and expand on them to incorporate stuff like protect and access, etc. There's only 2 slides in this webinar. All the rest of it is actual setup, and we play it back through video just to avoid any problems. And also do stick around. There will be a prize draw at the end. You don't have to stay for the whole webinar. As long as you've joined, you will be eligible to win the U7 Pro access point. During the course of this webinar, please feel free to ask any questions. I'll answer as many of them as possible. I'll try to keep an eye on them as we go. Alternatively, I will answer them at the end. So we're going to get straight into it. I think the first thing we need to look at is how to provision the controller or the cloud gateway, as Ubiquiti terms it. So this is the primary device for controlling and setting up your network environment. And provisioning this device or setting this up for the first time is probably one of the most important steps. The easiest way and the most common way that we see this done is typically through the Unify app. This is something you can download on Android or on iPhone. And basically, the initial setup is done through Bluetooth. So you discover the access point, you discover the controller or the cloud gateway, and you just simply add it in. In this instance, I've got a Enterprise Fortress gateway that I'm going to be setting up. We've got speed test blocked in the office, so it takes me a hot minute to recognize that here, but there we go. You can skip that speed test. This is all happening automatically on the device. This is real time, so this is the actual setup time it took to set up this device. And this is really where we see technicians that are out in the field setting up the controller for the first time. This is what they typically go through. This is ideal for environments where you want to enable remote handoff. So I tapped on remote handoff there. And basically what that means is as soon as the technician is done with the initial setup on their mobile phone, they can hand this off to the system administrator, who might sometimes be someone completely different. So you'll see there's firstly a pop-up to set up the access points. In this instance, the technician doesn't need to worry about that. And then you'll see there's a pop-up that says remote handoff pending. And what you can do is you can press on transfer there, and you can simply specify the email address of the system administrator. So it means that the technician out on site installing the equipment doesn't have to be the same person doing the full network setup, etc. It's pretty handy. It's relatively new, this handoff feature as well. And this is what we see a lot, especially in remote deployments, because the technician doesn't need a special set of skills. They can purely just install it. They can rack them and stack them. And once that deployment's done, the system admin takes over from there. Or it could be the same person, depending on your type of environment. So that's obviously with the application. The mobile app. There's another way to do it as well. This is more prevalent in environments where you don't want to set up remote access accounts. So scenarios that this would be deployed in is places where they have concerns about where the data is going to. So you can take one of these devices, set it up as a local access only device. In other words, all the information gets 100% contained within this appliance itself. There's no remote access, so you won't be able to access it through unified.ui.com. It's 100% local. You have to connect to it physically with the network cable in order to start connecting to it. The setup process is pretty similar, actually. I'm just connecting directly to the IP address of this device. In this instance, again, it's the EFG, just setting it up from scratch. In this instance as well, I'm going to skip the UI account portion, and it warns me that I'm losing out on a lot of the functionality, stuff like remote management, MFA, cloud backups, etc. So what it's going to do is I set a simple password. I say simple, and it has a 12-character requirement, and you can see me struggle here to remember a password that's 12 characters long. The nice part about creating a cloud account is that at least you have a recovery option through email, so just something to be aware of. This will also perform speed tests. The idea behind the speed test is for the device to measure your internet capability and kind of give you an analysis of how well your internet's performing versus the speed test result. Again, I take a second here to recognize that our speed test is block and just skip that. You can, of course, skip that as well and set a estimated throughput amount. So I'm just going 50-50. In this environment, it's picked up that there's something else hosting DHCP, and as a recommendation, it changes the IP address of my device. It's smart enough to do that. And it's very common to come across environments like that where you might have a third-party gateway in front of this that's already hosting DHCP. So in this instance, this device has just picked a free IP range, and it has now become connected. So I struggled around here for a little bit. I'm going to skip forward slightly. Basically, I'm trying to reach that device. I didn't take into account that it obviously moved IP addresses because of the other DHCP server. So skipping forward slightly, I eventually get it to connect on the correct IP address, which is the one that it told me during setup that I need to go to. But IT admins being IT admins will always skip the prompts. And basically, I just have to type in the password again. Again, that's a difficult password to remember, so I've messed it up a couple of times. And with that done, I essentially am able to get into the interface of this device and start to set it up from there. If I go to the admin section, you'll also see that the users is a local only account. There's no email address associated. It's just a username and a password, admin and a password. You can create a normal user accounts on this as well as additional administrators, just as local only. In this instance, you can take on remote access as well. So if you want to enable remote access down the line, you simply specify the email address and you can hand over the ownership of this controller or this cloud gateway down the line as well. So you're not stuck to just a local access only account if you change your mind down the line. So another key thing that we would typically set up is shadow mode. So shadow mode is a nice word for Ubiquiti's basically router redundancy, where you can have two gateways and they are basically a backup of each other. It's a good recommendation to go for this option, to use two EFGs or two UDM ProCs or something along those lines, where this enables you to essentially have a spare if one of your gateways goes down. Given the cost of these things, I think it's fair to say that it's a very valid option to get a spare one. Just in case something goes wrong, you can always just pull out the cable or pull out the unit and swap it out. There's two different modes with this. One of them employs VRRP, that's through the Ubiquiti EFG, and the UDM ProCs, etc. I'm not sure if they currently support VRRP. Last time I checked, they didn't, but basically that required some manual intervention where the EFG allowed automatic failover. So to me, it's a good option. It's a very valid thing, especially at the price point and considering how important that device is. So you've basically completed the initial setup of your controller or your cloud gateway. The next step would logically be to adopt your devices. I'm going to go through a couple of scenarios here that's very commonplace and we see people getting stuck on. This is probably 90% of the support requests that we get. So firstly, you'll get a prompt at the top right-hand side to say add the devices, or it can remind you later on. Just a note here that the interface does change between my all of my setup videos. That's because there was actually a firmware update between when I started and the last video. But anyway, and you'll see there's the two switches, or a switch and an access point in this environment. The keen-eyed amongst you will already spot a problem, but this is a very common thing that we come across. If I go try to adopt this, it does not want to adopt these devices. The keen-eyed amongst you might have noticed that the gateway is on 192.168.1.1 and the access point in the switch is on 0. So it's on a different IP address range, which means they cannot be adopted unless you do layer 3 adoption or something along those lines. So they give you a nice guide if you get stuck here. Ubiquiti's documentation has improved drastically over the last few years. And this is very good. They actually identify the cause here. They say, make sure you don't have a double DHCP environment where there's another device handing out DHCP, and the devices are basically set to DHCP, receive DHCP, and receiving the correct addresses as well. So another common thing that we see is adoption failing on the switches or access points. And for those of you unfamiliar, adoption is basically where the controller or the cloud gateway takes control of that switch or access point. It adopts it, it pushes the settings through, and it basically becomes the owner of that switch or that device. A very common scenario, or a sometimes common scenario that we come across, is where the switch or device is already adopted by something else. You'll see this in the interface. As soon as you start adoption, it will give you some info. It'll say this device cannot be adopted. The recommended step is to reset this device. This is because something else has already adopted this device, and basically once it's adopted to something else, there's no way to override it from your cloud gateway. So what I can do here is I can make sure that this device is indeed adopted by something else. It's not just a generic issue that I'm seeing. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to SSH into the switch in this instance, or the access point, and I'm going to see if the SSH credentials are the default SSH credentials. So one of the first steps that happens when the access point or switch gets adopted is it will override the SSH credentials, which is username of UBNT, password of UBNT. And in this instance, I'm SSHing with UBNT at the IP address of that U7 Pro. I type in the password and it tells me the password is incorrect, which means the default credentials have been overridden, which means there is no way for me to access this device. I can't log into it via SSH. It is a worthwhile thing to try if you're on an environment where someone's accidentally already adopted it before you reset the device. Sometimes a access point is mounted to the roof and it's 20 meters in the sky or something along those lines, and can be difficult to reach. So I normally try with SSH first, and it's also for this reason that we normally recommend making up a backup of previous SSH credentials. So if you're taking this device from one site to another, make a backup of the credentials and carry those credentials with you to the new environment so that you can SSH into this device and reset it from SSH. Another option that is often overlooked is the ability to remotely reset some devices through some PoE injectors. Massive air quotation marks here, so this works in some instances, and in some instances it does not. Some of the PoE injectors, you'll see there's a pin at the back. It says reset. Most people tend to think it resets the PoE injector. It doesn't. It resets, or it's supposed to reset, the access point or the device connected to it. I've had some luck with the U6 range. Some of the devices are perfectly fine with this reset capability, although mileage may vary. I recommend, as a technician, keep this thing spare in your backpack and just use it for when you need it. Basically, connect it inline, try the reset. If that doesn't work, then okay, you're going to have to get a cherry picker and you're going to have to go on to the roof or somewhere to go fetch that access point and factory reset it on the device itself. A little bit more painful, but I'll personally give this a try first. So Another common scenario that we see is remote adoption, where people are trying to adopt access points or switches to a controller that is hosted either in the cloud or in their own server environment. Remote adoption remains a very valid option for Ubiquiti. There's a couple of ways you can do this. The easiest ways is typically through SSH or DHCP option 43 and DNS. Those two options, so DHCP option 43 and DNS, Ubiquiti has a very detailed guide on how to do that. I'm not going to show that in this, it takes a little bit longer, but it is a good way to do it in bulk. If you're manually doing this per device, then SSH is the best way to do it. If you only have a few devices, this is fine. What I'm going to try to do here is connect up to one of my devices. In this instance, it's the USW24 PoE at the top. I'm going into its IP address. Obviously, your device needs to be in the same IP address range. It's going to say I'm basically connecting with default credentials of UBNT because the device is still in its default state. And the one we need to use is the setinform command. So setinform is the one I'm highlighting on screen, and that's basically the ability of stun to go across the internet, across the network, to reach your server irrespective of where it's at. So basically layer 3 adoption. So this is applicable both to environments where your server is in a different domain or different network segment in your local business, as well as a remotely hosted environment as well. In this instance, I'm hopping over to a Ubiquiti hosted instance, and basically you can subscribe to this and pay Ubiquiti a monthly fee, and they host this instance for you. What's nice about this is they give you the inform URL directly from there, so you can literally just go click on copy inform URL, and you paste that inform URL in, and as soon as I hit enter, that switch is going to become adoptable in my cloud environment. Makes things a lot simpler, and basically I can just click adopt. It's remotely adopted, and it should stay connected to this cloud server moving forward. So remote adoption is a very common scenario. Again, at scale, you will want to use DNS options or DHCP option 43, but depends on what you want to do. So as a next step, one of the typical things that I do is I check around for the firmware version. I'll go make sure that the firmware that I'm running is the correct version that I intend to be running on site. In this instance, I'm going to be adopting a whole bunch of client devices, or sorry, not client devices, switches, access points, etc. This process takes a little bit longer, but basically during this step, what it does is it provisions the SSH credentials. So it pushes through new SSH credentials to that client device. It also provisions through the settings of that device. A reminder that the settings on Ubiquiti is stored predominantly on the cloud gateway or the controller, not on the device itself. So those settings are getting pushed through from the controller or cloud gateway to the client device or the switch in this instance as we speak. This is done automatically. We don't really need to manually intervene here. So discovery and basically how these devices are found on the network is predominantly done through layer 2. It basically just broadcasts messages and it finds the devices automatically. So I'm going to give it a second there. You'll see it takes a while for it to go and update the device, push through its settings, etc. So like I said, the next thing I want to do typically is go change my firmware version, and I want to make sure that I'm indeed running the correct firmware version that I intend to be using. And what I mean by this is I want to make sure that I predominantly use the official firmware version and not the release candidate or early access or one of those. It depends on what you're going to be using this for. If it's in a lab environment, early access or release candidate is fine, but for a production environment, I would not recommend this. So this segment has moved. It's now on the control panel. And basically, you'll see me navigate to it there. I can install the different applications from here as well. My recommendation is typically to disable auto updates and to vet your firmware updates before you do them. There's a good reason for this. It's in a production environment, you don't just want to constantly be going for the latest and greatest. There is an advantage to going for auto updates. It's simpler, etc. But Ubiquiti now has an option to simplify your firmware management and do it in bulk so that you can disable auto update and then at key intervals decide when you want to update. I'm going to show this in the next slide. Basically, through the site manager, we now have an option to do this firmware updating. If your site manager doesn't look like this, it's because you're probably not enrolled for the early access version, or they haven't rolled this out to the normal production environment. I'm running early access for the purposes of this webinar, so we can see what's coming from our client devices and from our network environment. In this instance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the site manager, and this is again hosted on unify.ui.com. This is for all of my remote sites. So this is all of the controllers or cloud gateways that I set up with a Ubiquiti account. As soon as I've added my account into it, it will show up in this list. You'll see there's a bunch of offline devices, there's a bunch of online devices. It can be a bit difficult to manage, especially if you have thousands of sites. So the first thing I normally do is I set up a site group. This is relatively new as well, and that icon will only appear if you have multiple sites. And what you can do through this is give your site group a name and select the devices that you want to make part of this group. If I was doing this for leader, I would just say this is leader's offices, and it's very unique. In the site group, it now allows me additional capabilities. I'm going to skip over site magic there for a second, but the first thing it can do is it allows me to see per site group what the ISP performance is like. So I can filter out all the rest of the ISPs that I don't care about. The next thing is I can also see the different devices that are on the site group, which are online, which are offline, the firmware versions that they're running, how up to date that firmware version is. If I want to, I can quickly drill down into each one of these as well. And they even take this a step further. You can do this on an application level as well. So it will show me that some firmware updates are available. So in my site group for the Dream Machine Special Edition, there is a firmware update for both the network component and for the Protect component. You can select them and just say update selected. Once that process kicks off, it's automated. So you can kind of do a rolling update per se, where you select multiple devices and it will start the update process automatically for all of them. It's a nice and easy way to manage your firmware in bulk. And again, I normally recommend vetting your firmware ahead of time. I get lots of questions around how specifically do we review our firmware. If I don't enable automatic updates, how do I know what firmware is coming? It's very simple. From Ubiquiti, they list all of their both up and coming and generally available firmware on the community.ui.com page. So it's basically Ubiquiti's community forum. And this is free for anyone with the Ubiquiti account to access. If you don't see the EA option, you just need to go to accounts.ui.com and enroll yourself to the early access program. There's some caveats with that. Basically, some of the information is protected and you can't share it, so just something to be aware of. But as part of this, you get to see what firmware is currently in production and what firmware is coming. Again, for production environments, I'll go for general access firmware. For labs, where you're playing with this, the early access firmware is fine. Early access is great to see the latest and greatest features that Ubiquiti are looking to introduce, but obviously we know there's a caveat of something might be not 100% correct in that firmware. So just something to be aware of. Again, this is a massive recommendation from my side is do go join their community forum. They have tons of replies under each of these posts. If something's gone wrong on someone's environment, it's very easy to go check the replies from that. People are very proactive with this. I'll normally go check the replies before I apply any of the firmware versions to see if something's broken in anyone else's environment and how I could go, if that's going to affect me or not. Generally, their firmware is pretty stable, but sometimes there's minute changes that fix or that breaks certain scenarios within people's environments. But more often than not, it just fixes issues, but just something to be aware of. So depending on the switches that you're using, the logical next step typically would be to start looking at your switch environment. And something that's very important, especially in large deployments, is setting up your switch priority. By default, Ubiquiti will use RSTP for switch priority in order to avoid network loops. And I've got a enterprise USW Pro here and a USW 24 PoE. Both of these are layer 3 switches, so I have RSTP capabilities on them. And generally what we want to do is we want to go change our core switches to be a higher priority or lower priority. Basically the number goes down, but the priority goes up. And what I can do here is I'm going to go into the core switch. This is the most closest switch to the actual cloud gateway. And I'm going to make this priority a lower value. This is very commonplace. So 4096 is very commonplace on a core switch. And the idea is to give that switch the best chance of being the root bridge. For example, we would typically use this on aggregation switches or in multi-switch environments. The other options that you have for distribution switches, these are typically switches that are still connecting to other switches. I would also go change the RSTP priority to be a higher value than the 4096, but it's not the highest value that you will typically set up. In a hotel example, that would be something like where you have the distribution as the aggregation switch and the server room, and then the distribution switches are the switches on each floor to aggregate all of the smaller switches downstream from that. Typically, this should get set to something like 16,384 as one of the values, and this is basically just a way to set up an order of priority. The last layer that you will typically set up is your access layer, and this is for connecting to client devices like laptops, VoIP phones, etc. This is normally your lowest priority. It's typically something like 61,444. Basically, it's a higher value than the rest of them. It is also a good idea to create a backup root bridge, slightly higher priority than the one I've set here. So this is 4096. I normally set up a secondary switch or aggregation switch with a very high priority. So I'll make it something like 8,192, which is just above this one. And it basically means that if the primary root bridge goes down, you do have the option to fail over to a secondary root bridge. Just best practice. Another good thing to test proactively is if you are using a device with two power supplies, that the power supplies are connected up correctly and that the failover capability works correctly as well. Just going to briefly interrupt here to just say for everyone that joined a little bit late, this webinar is going to run a little bit longer than normal. My apologies for that. If you cannot stay for the whole webinar, the webinar is recorded and will be available on YouTube this afternoon as well. So just as an FYI. Okay, so in this environment, I've got a EFG. It's got two power supplies plugged into it. More and more devices will start featuring this capability, and you'll see me hover over the power supplies there. We can see the power draw. It's nice to get a visualization of that. I normally recommend tasting this. Firstly, making sure that it picks up both the power supplies are there, and that if there is a power outage, that it actually picks that up correctly. So in this instance, I'm just refreshing my screen quickly, and I disconnected one of the cables. You can see it's failed over to power supply 2. But if I go to my alerts, I didn't really notice anything. By default, it doesn't really tell you when this has happened. So a normal thing that I would go set is I would go set the option to tell me if it's using backup power. I filled it around here to search for that power setting a little bit, but there we go, using backup power. I'll typically tell it to send me an email as well as an alert. It's just, again, best practice to try and incorporate this. We are going to look at the events a little bit more later on as well. So there we go. We can see the switch or the power supply is still down. I'm just standing up and connecting it here. And as soon as I refresh the screen, you'll see that that power supply shows it's up again. And if the alert had been set up beforehand, I would have been notified that the power has been disconnected and resumed. So there we go, all working as intended. So now onto more of the practical setup side of things, so the network side of things. So Basically, we're going to create some internal networks, some corporate networks, and we're going to assign IP address ranges, VLANs, etc. So the first thing we're going to do is go over to the network segment in the settings. We're going to basically reconfigure our default network. So this is the network that comes with the Cloud Gateway. I'm going to rename it to my internal network so that this is for my my Ubiquiti devices connecting to this network. I recommend changing the default from the 192 range to the 10 range, simply because most of the devices you buy these days come pre-configured on the 192 range, and this just means that if they connect something to your network, it's not going to clash. You'll see the default network has limited options around guest network capabilities, isolation, etc. That's because it's default. We're going to change that later on. A good practice to employ as well is to set up DHCP guarding so that if someone sets up another DHCP server in your environment and you're afraid of that causing conflicts, DHCP guarding will try to prevent that by pointing it only to the DHCP server that you've specified. You can do stuff like NTP server. You can do DHCP option 43 for remote provisioning from here as well. You can rename the local domain. And you can do stuff like setting custom DHCP options, again, if you're employing that in your environment. The next one we're going to do is a more traditional network setup, and we're going to assign a VLAN to this one. So the default network cannot be changed from the VLAN assignment of 1. You do have an option to select a different router as well, so you can select a third-party router. If something else is in your network handing out VLANs, then the third-party network only is the option. Alternatively, you can just use the EFG for that. I'm specifying a different IP address range here. I'm keeping it relatively logical. I'm basically going 10.0.20.1, and I'll kind of correspond the VLAN ID to that, so VLAN 20. This is it's a corporate network, so basically we connect laptops, etc. to this. What I want to do in this environment is set up some isolation. In other words, isolate this network out so that it can't be reached by anything else on the network or any other networks. And also employ content filtering to block out basic bad types of content. I'll use the work profile there and then also set up DHCP guarding again. And again, there's a couple of options to apply there. Depends on what you want specifically, but just as a very basic network setup, this is the best way to get started. Once you're done adding the corporate network, in this instance, I'm also going to be adding networks for the rest of my environment. So guest networks, very commonplace. I'm going to keep all the settings in place. Again, just change the IP address range. I'll just go 30.1 here. I'll make it VLAN 30 to logically match that. I'll say that this is a guest network. There's an option for that. As soon as you tick this on, it applies automatic firewall rules to block guest traffic from reaching the rest of your network. You can override that if you want, but that network isolation is basically enabled by default. You cannot override it from this interface. Again, content filtering, I'll go apply some sort of content filtering around this. Ubiquiti has a little bit of an outline about what that means online as well. And again, I'll set up a DHCP guard to make sure that the DHCP server, if someone accidentally connects up something that's broadcasting DHCP, my network integrity stays intact. So I'll add this guest network in. And then the last network that I'm very quickly going to create here is I'm going to quickly set up a IoT network. So this is more meant for printers, IoT stuff, any smart device on your network, those IoT light bulbs, etc. This is a separate dedicated network for them. The reason I create so many networks is because it allows us granular control over every segment of our network. Then I can say that I want to apply speed limits or specific firewall rules or something to a specific network segment. And that makes it a lot easier in terms of logical definition to kind of define these things out. Again, last thing I'm going to do here is the HTTP guarding, so you'll know the process offhand by now. If you have more networks that you need to create, so for example, a VoIP network, camera network, anything additional, you'd follow the same logic. Basically, you just set them up, and keep them logical. I'd again recommend giving them names that make sense. There's nothing worse than walking into an IT environment and all the names are gibberish. So make it something that's practical and usable. So just looking at some of the other options that are available in this network segment, I can set up stuff like IoT auto discovery. In other words, IoT devices sending out multicast traffic to find other devices on the network. Stuff like streaming devices or casting devices is a very common use case for that, but depends on whether you're going to have that in place or not. Once we have the networks in place, a logical step is to start setting up our Wi-Fi. Obviously, this is a very common scenario. I'm going to give this Wi-Fi a password. This is just a pre-share key that I'm going to use. And you can choose to either go for one Wi-Fi for your entire business, or you can segment out your Wi-Fi as well. It's best practice to use as few SSIDs as possible, but in some instances you can't avoid it. In this instance, what I'm saying is the corporate network, if someone connects to corporate Wi-Fi, it's connecting directly to VLAN 20, which is my corporate network. I'm not going to employ captive portal or anything like that. Band steering in general is a fine idea. You can enable client device isolation so that clients on the same network cannot find each other in a business environment or hospitality. That's a good idea. UAP-SD is a good recommendation as well. It's a power saving mechanism. Most devices support that. Play around with it. You can set up Wi-Fi speed limits, although we prefer to do this through a different way. And then you'll see all the rest of the settings that you can apply through this. Minimum data rate controls is something we extensively discuss in training. Highly recommend you guys check that out as well. And then of course we can apply our security protocol. It's not allowing me to select WPA2 in this instance because I've got the 6 gigahertz band connected. I've selected that as the one of the options in the Wi-Fi band segment. So 6 gigahertz requires WPA3. I'm going to caution against using mixed mode WPA2, WPA3. I'll get more into that in a second. You can also set up a Wi-Fi blackout period to say that your Wi-Fi should be shut down during certain intervals. If you don't want people accessing your Wi-Fi after business hours, for example, I'm just setting a quick example here. Then you can say no internet after that time. So one of the things that I will generally recommend here is for your 6 gigahertz band, treat it with caution. So 6 gigahertz is new. It's part of Wi-Fi 6E and Wi-Fi 7. I normally set up a separate 6 gigahertz SSID. And this is because a lot of the times the client devices either don't find the 6 gigahertz band when it's a common SSID, or in Windows, it's just invisible. You don't find the SSID. This is because the 6 gigahertz band is still so new. The implementation of that still requires some work. And WPA2 is fine, but WPA3 has some mixed results. Treated with caution. Also, just this will change obviously in time, and it's not just Ubiquiti; it's everyone facing the same problem. But also something very important to note is that 6 gigahertz is not supported on Windows 10. You will not be able to get it working on there. So I also set up typically a separate IoT network or IoT Wi-Fi. In this instance, you'll see I've set up a guest Wi-Fi and I've set up an IoT Wi-Fi. And it's a good idea to do this to just, again, segment out your client devices. I like to do it on the 2.4 gigahertz network for an IoT device so that it can't accidentally go onto the wrong network. It is also a good idea to set up your channels so that you have non-overlapping channels. There's a couple of options around this. Ubiquiti have just added the radio manager in. Radio manager is a quick, easy way for you to get an overview of your different access points and the channels they're on. I don't have any clients connected to this, but if I did, it would show it in that list. And I can also get an overview of what my environment looks like. If you had a U7 Pro Max, you could also do RF scanning to see what the actual RF environment looks like. There's another option in the interface called channelization, and it's basically automatic channel optimization. In very complex network environments or Wi-Fi environments, it's recommended to manually assign the channels. The channel optimization does work, but it definitely has limitations as well. So to set the channels on your access point, it's very simple. effectively, you will want to go onto the access point itself. You can set the channel size. Generally, smaller is better, although you do trade off some throughput. And basically, we're going to make sure that our access point doesn't overlap in channels with any of my neighboring access points, if I had any. Normally, I also recommend playing around with the output power of the radio. You can set a custom value. I try to restrict my RF so that it's contained within the room that I am in. Again, our training massively expands on why that is. You can also set up stuff like minimum RSSIs to kind of prevent clients that are at the edges of connectivity from dragging down the speed of your network. So I normally recommend employing that. It is a soft kicking mechanism. In other words, it cannot completely disconnect the client, but it does help. You'll also see that if you set up the 5 gigahertz spectrum, it does warn you about the DFS channels. If you do start using DFS channels, there is a chance that you will get interference from radar. So something to take into account. Again, there's methods to avoid that. And you'll see I also take on an option there that's called interference blocker. Interference blocker is a more strict way to enforce that minimum RSSI value. So if the client signal gets too weak, it will attempt to kick that client off. This again requires fiddling. There's no set rule around this. It depends on your environment. And of course, if you want to turn off that pesky LED, you do have the option for that. Personally, I love the blue light, but in hotel environments, people look at me funny if I say that. So those are the typical settings I would go do on the AP side of things, and I would work through each of my access points to make sure I'm not using overlapping channels. So the Wi-Fi is essentially working now. I've set up a corporate network, a guest network, IoT network. Our switches in this instance, though, are still effectively dumb. They are just transparently taking in all network traffic and passing it on to where that traffic should go. We haven't assigned any VLANs to this, and we haven't really applied any major changes to the switches apart from the RSTP Priority. Normally, what I would go do at this point is I would go play with the switch ports to do my VLAN assignment. So I've already set up the corporate networks, etc. And what I can go do now is I can go into each one of my switch ports and I can go assign a VLAN to it specifically. So I can just go onto port 3 in this instance. I can say that this port is enabled, disabled, and this is the native VLAN that it belongs to. If I set it to the corporate network, or the IoT network in this instance, any device that I then plug into that switch port will be on that VLAN. And there's a ton of settings around here. You can turn off PoE if you want to. You can also enable port isolation. So if you want client devices on the same switch to not be reachable from each other, you can turn that on, but this is contained to the switch only. You can also turn on voice VLAN. I've had mixed results with that. Treat with caution. But do have a play around if you're using VoIP on your network. Best practice is to also disable any Ethernet ports that you're not going to be using. So if you know, for example, that you have a 48 port switch, you're only going to be using 6 of those ports, turn off the ones that you're not using. We don't want anyone to just walk up to our switch and plug something that shouldn't be connected on my network into my environment and potentially mess with stuff. You can do that in bulk if you wish. You can select multiple devices or multiple switch ports and do that as well. It can be a bit difficult to remember what you set up on which switch though. And for that, Ubiquiti has this new VLAN display. So basically it shows you which VLANs are enabled on which port. So this is showing me that the IoT network is enabled on that port 3, and then the rest of the networks as well, the different port assignments that are set up on them. Normally, it's just the default port. At the top, it also shows you the VLAN assignment, which makes it a lot easier. So another switch here, just in its default, you can see there's nothing set up. So this is all fine and well. It's a nice and easy way to set this up, making sure your VLAN assignment's done correctly. Another key thing that I would typically do through this is think about how I'm going to assign VLANs to my Wi-Fi access points. If I just go to the AP on this network port and I assign a VLAN, it basically means all of the connecting client devices will go onto that VLAN, which is oftentimes not what we want. I want some devices to go onto my VoIP network and some devices to go onto my corporate network, for example. So this is a very common thing. We're going to overcome this problem a little bit later on through radius authentication. There's another couple of ways we can do that as well. But ports assignments is very commonplace. And also Ubiquiti, if your switch does lose these settings, Ubiquiti does have an option to restore the settings if you have another switch running the same config, or alternatively, you can make a backup of the config as well. Another very common thing that we see is setting up our switches with something like link aggregation or lag groups for our SFP ports. So this is an uplink port, a very common setup scenario where I'm uplinking my USW24 to my USW Pro 48. And what I'm doing is I'm setting up port aggregation. So port aggregation is kind of like switch stacking, but not to the same extent. Basically what it does is you specify the ports that you want to aggregate. They have to be logical port numbers. They have to be sequential. In other words, port 49 and 50 in this instance, you can't just go port 49 and 52. They have to be sequential. And once that's done, it basically shows that you'll see the icon change. It now shows that those ports are in link aggregation mode. Link aggregation provides us two advantages. One is additional throughput. So if I had two 10 gig Ethernet ports or SFP ports in this instance, it would basically double that to 20 gigabits per second. The other advantage it gives us is that if you lose connectivity to one of those switch ports, or one of the ports goes down, or the Ethernet cable gets disconnected, you have resiliency. So it can fail back to the other one as well. That's exactly what I'm going to be doing in this environment. I've got my two switches connected. Basically, they just have two Ethernet cables running between them. I'm not using the SFP port in this instance because I don't have any SFP modules with me, but I've set up two network cables running between the two switches, which is obviously going to cause a network loop. So these aren't set up currently for lag groups, and it will, in effect, cause a problem. So I've also got my client devices connected to the different switches. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into the 24 port switch, the smaller one first, and you'll see it says it's blocked by STP. It's picked up that there's a network loop. And because I don't have lag group set up yet, it's blocking that continuously. What I can do now is I just go to aggregation. I apply it. I specify the port numbers. And with that, I need to basically start at the edge. So start from the furthest switch away and move your way backwards. And the next thing I need to do is go into the upstream switch from that point. And you'll see again, it switches over to the link aggregation view. If I then go back to the other one, you'll see that icon change in time. It stops the blocking. It does still continue, obviously, the blocking to prevent the loop, but it's essentially established a full lag group. On Ubiquiti, you can apply up to 8 ports per lag group. So you can do up to 8 ports in one lag group, and you can have multiple lag groups per switch as well. On my 48 port switch, I had 6 lag groups set up with 8 ports each. So it's pretty scalable, but that's basically one of the key advantages of it. So let's see this lag in action. Basically, I've got my client devices connected, or my switches still connected to each other, and I've got 2 client devices connecting to each of the respective switches. I'm going to start a ping test between my 2 client devices, and you'll see that obviously I get a nice low latency ping. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go look at the ports, and I'm going to disconnect one of those switch ports to see the impact of this disconnection as soon as I disconnect that cable. So I'm going to pull out, I think it's port 39 that I disconnect there. So you see it misses a ping there and instantly it's back up. That is link aggregation in action. So just as quickly as that, it's failed over to the secondary link and it's keeping that link alive. If I go reconnect that cable, you'll see that it just, again, does pretty much the same thing. It misses a ping and then it becomes connected again. Very easy to do this. It's very easy to set up. So while this runs, I just genuinely want to talk about switch stacking. So a lot of people compare this to switch stacking. This isn't exactly the same. Switch stacking provides you with switch level redundancy, where this is link level redundancy. It achieves a lot of the same results in terms of resiliency, but there's no failover if the switch goes down. In the newer enterprise range of switches that Ubiquiti is introducing, they have mentioned that they are going to support multi-chassis lag groups, which basically means that you will have switch level redundancy as well. Something that's very important. The new campus switch that Ubiquiti is about to bring out does support that as well. So I'm genuinely interested to hear if anyone has any requirements in terms of stacking beyond that capability. If you have questions, please feel free to post them through on the question section. I'm happy to take a look at them and advise afterwards as well, see what additional features you would want from that. So another common thing to do is enable switch port isolation, basically prevent client devices from seeing each other on the same switch. And in this instance, I'm going to, again, just run a quick ping between my laptop and my desktop, both of those connected to my 48 port switch. As soon as I go into the port manager, switch on port isolation, we'll see the effect of this kick in. So port isolation there, and once I've applied that, it's going to take a few seconds. So this is because it's an established station. It's going to take a while for that to continue to do everything. Also important, you need to do it on both. So you need to do it on every device you want to isolate from each other. And you'll see it takes a second for it to go through. It takes it a while to actually drop the connection there, but there you go. You can see it eventually drops the connection. That's because that established session was going, and the same thing will apply if I disable that functionality as well. So this is only on the same switch. You cannot apply this across multiple switches currently, as an FYI. Okay, so your access points and switches are ready. You've set up the Wi-Fi. You've done a lot of the config. There's a few more steps that I normally recommend to bring into place to secure your environment. So next thing we want to take a look at typically is to go play around with the security settings. So settings, security, and you'll see we have a ton of options here. It's pretty secure by default, but there is some stuff I would do. Firstly, I'll set up a honeypot so that I can pick up attempts at hacking or attempts at something doing errant things on my network. So I'll go create that first. You can do it on multiple networks as well if you wish. I normally don't fiddle around with the stuff too much. One of the things I do play with is my country restrictions. And what I would generally go do is block certain regions. It's not typically recommended to just go allow Australia because it will cause some problems. You can also choose to enable ad blocking if you wish. Be careful with this. A lot of the times users complain that they're trying to search something on Google and the first result is an ad and they can't go through to it. And that's why I would normally not disable it on everything or enable it on everything. It's also recommended to set up the DNS shield so that you're using trusted DNS providers and that your search query doesn't, or your attempt to DNS something doesn't get redirected to something it's not supposed to. Intrusion protection and prevention. This varies depending on the type of cloud gateway that you have. Some of them have more capabilities, some of them a little bit less. You can customize these capabilities and what to inspect through the detection sensitivity. By default, if you select high, it will just tick everything essentially. This uses basically open source definitions at the moment. There is in future going to be an option for a paid version that uses paid security definitions as well. More on that to come in time. But normally I would go set this up. I would go set up my filtering, set up basic protection, and also do stuff like blocking the dark web, etc., and applying this to the specific networks that I know need them. Another thing that I typically go do is, I went too far there. I will typically go look at the rest of the security features. A common thing is to point some of your traffic to a specific port. You can also set up ACL rules and even customize traffic and firewall rules. This is where I spend a lot of the time normally. So a very common thing that I would do here is I would, for example, go slow down my Microsoft updates. If, let's say, for example, Microsoft pushes out a big update tomorrow, or Apple, or whoever, I don't want that to just instantly go out to all of my client devices on my Wi-Fi and it slows down my entire network. What I will do instead is I'll go set up a speed limit. I'll apply it to my corporate network. I'll say this applies specifically to Windows updates or whatever you want it to apply to. I'll set the speed limit. I'll say it can do 10 megabits per second at a max, and it means there's still adequate throughput for the rest of the stuff on my network. I can also set times during which this applies. I can say during the day, I don't want that. I don't want it to do updates. And during the evening, it's fine to do these system updates while my employees are not at the office. So that's a very simple way to add a rule. I normally create tons and tons of rules to block out certain types of content or slow it down or redirect it or do a whole bunch of stuff. You can do this on either a network level or you can do this on a device level as well. In this instance, what I'm saying is on the corporate and guest network, I don't want people to do social networking, online games, etc., etc. So all the stuff that I define there. And essentially once that's selected, I save this rule and that type of content becomes blocked for whatever I've specified. Super simplified, easy way to do this. There is also an option to do more advanced setups as well. So if I go to the advanced tab, you'll see you have a lot more flexibility around this. We've actually done an entire video on how to set up the advanced firewall rules. It's on our YouTube channel. It's called the Technical Webinar Ubiquiti Firewall and Security. It takes you step by step through this process of setting up the advanced firewall rules. Please do go check it out. That video is very focused on inter-VLAN blocking, which now to a certain extent we can do through the network settings by setting up that network isolation. But on your default network, it is still recommended to go apply inter-VLAN blocking in some instances. So please do check that video out. It's a very good example of that. On the EFG, we also have the option for Next AI, which is basically SSL inspection. We're not going to do a full SSL inspection setup on this environment. Again, we have a full video on this on our YouTube channel. Please do go check it out. It's epic to see the type of stuff you can pick up on a network, prevent, block, and view. And it should also be treated with a fair amount of caution. It is a pretty intrusive protocol if you don't set it up correctly. Some of the other stuff that we'll typically set up. So this is, again, all the stuff that I would normally employ on a business. It's stuff that almost every environment that I go into, I will apply typically policy-based routing to direct some traffic to some WAN ports. So for example, I have a normal NBN connection on WAN port 1 and a high priority business network connection on WAN 2. In this instance, what I can do is I can specify certain sources or certain networks. I can say, for example, it's the VoIP network. I'll say that this is the source. I can specify specific regions if the traffic is going in that direction, and then go, okay, cool, you have to use WAN port 2. The more prevalent setup that I would typically do on this is not based on destination. I would typically just go all traffic on the VoIP network, or in this instance, I'm selecting a specific device. I would just go all traffic from that device should go out across WAN 2. And this is also important if you're applying stuff like VLANs, etc., or sorry, VPNs, etc., and you want to override it in certain instances, you can do that. Some other options around here as well, you can do static routes, OSPF. I'm not going to expand on that too much. Just important that when you're using OSPF, you cannot use the Site Magic function at the same time. Site Magic uses OSPF in the background. And they've also just recently added the ability to do DNS and NAT as well. So tons of capabilities around this. And also on OSPF, you can now see the neighboring of the different OSPF routers as well. So one of the last couple of steps that we have to take here is in terms of our system setup and making sure we get alerts and our users are configured correctly. The first thing I'll typically go do is I will go to the system settings and make sure that my region is correct. This impacts the Wi-Fi bands that your access points operate on, and if you do it incorrectly, it can be detrimental and you can be in breach of the IRP. There's also new activity logging capabilities, so you can report what's happening on your environment to external servers as well. So tons of new ones have been added, and you can also specify what you want to push across along with that. If you're brave enough, you can obviously build your API into it. Ubiquiti has just launched its API. One of the common settings that I do turn off is the Wi-Fi MAN capability to prevent savvy users from connecting to my environment and using Wi-Fi MAN to see the IP addresses of everything on my network. Another common thing that I will go do is I will go change my backup frequency. I'll specify when it should back up and what it should back up. If you say settings only, it will take the config from this device and back that up. If you specify a date, it basically takes all of the system logs and pushes it through across as well. You can say the maximum number of files to keep, the backup frequency, on what day it should back up, what time of day it should back up. So I will typically go something like 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning, although that's a double-edged sword because a lot of the times if it breaks, then you'll be called to it 3 o'clock in the morning. So just thinking about when you're doing that. So another thing that I typically do as well is I will go disable wireless meshing. This is depending on your environment, but this is a common step that I do take. I don't tend to use wireless meshing in my environment, but it's something that you'll have to play around with. All the settings here is pretty much stuff you play around with. The one thing that I will recommend keeping, though, is your SSH credentials, making an offline backup of this so that if you need to ever SSH into one of your devices, you have those credentials. That's basically the credentials that get pushed through as part of the adoption process. The wireless connectivity, you'll see I turn off wireless meshing there. Wireless meshing can be a bit finicky, lack of better word. So if I don't use it, I will always turn it off. If you're using AI, next AI inspection, then you can manipulate the SSL certificate here. And you can also check for firmware updates. And there's another way for you to kind of enroll your device into early access as well. So that's the majority of the settings that I will typically go play with and set on my customer's environment. And our environment's in this instance now pretty much good to go. There's not really too much more that I need to do. Some of the stuff that I want to know as an IT admin is I want to get notified if stuff goes wrong in my environment. So a couple of places to do this at. One of them is to go to push notifications in the control panel, and you can set specifically what you want to be notified of. Stuff I generally set is to alert me if there's updates, depending on whether you want to see that or not. I want to see if anyone's removed or added an admin. Obviously, if it's my environment, I want to know who's coming and going. And I can also do stuff like set alerts for when there's a backup created, etc. If you go to the log settings at the bottom, you'll see there's a ton more options that you can turn on. A couple of critical ones, typically if you're using backup internet, I want to be notified of that. Using backup power, I want to be notified of that. There's a couple of things you can tick that if you're experiencing radius issues or DNS issues, etc., or even rogue client devices, you can be notified of those as well. In terms of the devices, if there's something new adopted in my environment, and one specific one that I will always flick on is channel radar detection, especially if you're using DFS, that should be turned on all environments. Rogue access point detection as well, to check if someone's broadcasting the same SSID as you. And also I want to be notified when there's threats. So those are all the options that I would normally flick on in my customer environment so that I know what's going on. I promise we're almost done with the webinars. Thank you guys for sticking around so long. So some of the final steps that I'll take here. Your network is ready, your Wi-Fi is running, your channel is selected, your alerts are set up, your security is up and running, everything's good to go. Next thing we need to do is obviously onboard users. For smaller environments, there's nothing really that you need to do. There's effectively nothing that needs to be set up. The users can basically just use the pre-shared key that you've given them to connect to the Wi-Fi, or you can just connect their devices to the switch ports that you set up previously. Job done. In larger businesses, there's normally a little bit more complexity. One of the most common challenges that we face is placing devices into the correct VLAN if they are connecting wirelessly. I said earlier, we have a mechanism for that. It's called Radius, and this is how we use it. Essentially, what you do is the controller itself, or the cloud gateway, functions as the Radius server. You can also set up an external Radius server if you wish. With this, basically just flick it on for whether it applies to wired and wireless networks, one or the other, or both. And then you can set up Radius users. This can either be a Radius user that's a username and password, or it can be a MAC address as well. Just make the username and password, the MAC address of the device, and then based on that device connecting to the network, it'll go to the VLAN that you specify. It automatically sets the tunnel types, etc., and it automatically, when that user connects, then will be on the correct VLAN. So in a business environment where you want to have, for example, an IT administrator that's capable of seeing your Ubiquiti devices and the rest of the network, but you don't want a corporate user to do that, then that's the way you would go do that. This is just one more step that you have to take to enable Radius. Radius relies on WPA2 Enterprise or WPA3 Enterprise. You specify the Radius profile that you want to use, and as soon as I've gone and applied that change, the users will essentially be prompted for username and password on sign up. And if they enter that MAC address or that username and password, they will be placed into that specific VLAN. So it makes it nice and easy. Another option is to use private pre-shared keys. This is brand new from Ubiquiti. It's unticked in this instance and it's disabled, and it's because I'm using WPA2 Enterprise. If I go change that, we'll see that it becomes available. And private pre-shared keys is basically where you create a password per VLAN. So you can set up multiple passwords that point to the same VLAN or multiple passwords that point to different VLANs. So for example, here I'm creating a password for VLAN 20. I'm just made in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I can create a separate password that's a completely different password and do the same thing again, point it to VLAN 20. So it means that if you have 2 users, you can specify for each of those users a unique password. When that user leaves, you can revoke that password as well, which means they lose access. Where we use this massively is in hotel environments where you want the guests walking into the room to be placed into the same VLAN as the TV on the wall so that they can cast. Private pre-shared keys is awesome for that. So another way to enroll your users is Ubiquiti's identity. A lot of you might have seen this to some extent. If you haven't played with this already, please do play with it now. It is extremely important. There are some vital changes coming to this in the future that'll make this very applicable to all of your environments. I'm being a little bit cagey about the info here, but it's going to revolutionize the way your clients connect. So please do play around with identity. What I'm doing in this instance is I'm creating a user. This user is not an administrator, it's just a regular user. I can set an onboarding date for this user. Say this new person starts on the 21st of November, and then I essentially create that user. That user automatically gets sent an email with credentials, and they can then load those credentials onto either their mobile phone or their PC or both. And they install the identity application on that device. And all they have to do to connect to Wi-Fi, or in this instance a VPN, is tap on the button. There's no need to know what the Wi-Fi credentials are. There's no need to know what the VPN credentials are. You can set this up as you please. This will create a new Wi-Fi SSID, so something to be aware of as well. And basically, it will automatically send out the invites, or you can manually send out these invites as well. And that user and all the other users that I've added in the user segment now gets notified that they have this app available to them and they can connect. You can see how frequently this person's used this application, and you can apply some configs to this as well. More importantly, I can deactivate this account afterwards as well. If Alex leaves the company or John leaves the company, then I can very easily deactivate that account. So this is really, really easy, and especially if you use multiple apps like the Protect application or Access or any of those things, this gives you super easy access to those features. Of course, you can also create multiple admins. For most environments, we do create multiple admins. I will normally go set up the primary management account and then a couple of accounts for local management. So somebody like a on-site IT person that is just looking to, from random times, make small changes that I've given them instruction to do or something along those lines. You can use predefined rules to do this, or you can say, for example, that you set up a specific role or purpose. Site admin is probably the best if you have a local IT person, because it gives them all the core functionality, but they can't boot you off as an administrator. And if you have more applications loaded, so for protect and access, etc., you can also block access on those as well. And again, you'll see when that person's signed in, what they have access to, and you can also restrict it to local access only, should you wish. Again, it's as simple as that. Remove that user. Very, very easy to do it. Another thing that's often overlooked is user groups. And this is basically where we create, for example, a sales team, a product management team, or something along those lines, add them into a group, and we can apply rules or access to these groups in bulk. You can also set up subgroups if you wish, and you can also obviously provision out those identity invites if you wish as well. So this is something that I highly, highly recommend you guys get across. It is a very important feature from Ubiquiti. The last couple of things I would normally do, this is going to be very quick, is to typically also set up VPN access, whether this be site-to-site or to your individual users. The easiest way for an individual user to connect is to use the Teleport app. It requires the client uses the Wi-Fi Man app on their phone. Alternatively, you can set up a VPN server, a full-fledged normal VPN server. The preferred one is WireGuard. It's probably the most secure, newest technology that is available on these devices. And basically, you will need to have a static external IP address if you're using something like WireGuard. There's an option for using alternative addresses for clients as well, which kind of tries to do like a dynamic DNS type of allocation, but it's basically your environment still relies on a static external IP address. So basically, carrier grade NAT needs to be disabled. The WireGuard app, so I'm just scrolling through it there at the top, is basically you just click on the tunnel that you've created, and from a user's perspective, they just tap on it, they connect. You can also do OpenVPN or LTTP, depending on which you want to use. OpenVPN and WireGuard is preferred over LTTP. LTTP is getting a bit long in the tooth, so generally not preferred. You can also set up this controller to be a VPN client so that all of the downstream connecting client devices automatically use this VPN tunnel. So if, for example, I had a NordVPN subscription and I wanted to import that to secure all of my downstream connectivity, I can do that as well. And then for site-to-site, you have OpenVPN and IPsec that you can set up. Although I'm going to be honest here and say that by far the easiest way to do this is to use the SiteMagic tool. So SiteMagic basically uses OSPF and to establish a core router, and all the connecting other routers from there essentially don't need a external IP address. They can use internal IP address as well. So to do this, you select the two devices you want to connect together. You select the networks that don't overlap, and you just click connect. Done. That's the easiest way to do site-to-site VPNs and OSPF setup. Super, super easy from there. Okay, I firstly just want to thank you guys so much for bearing with me for this hour and 12-minute webinar. Apologies for the length. I really appreciate it. We have, just as a FYI, a whole bunch of content on our YouTube channel at Leader Academy AU. We have around 2,000 subscribers. We load content on here all the time. This webinar will be available here this afternoon for you to view. What I love about this is you get to see it at your private time in the evening when you're chilling on your couch and you just want to quickly look at the latest and greatest from Ubiquiti. So